Welcome back to Clean Titans. Today we're exploring the exciting intersection of agriculture and solar energy with Jake Marley from Hyperion Systems, a leader in agrivoltaic R&D. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ellie. I'm excited to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. Hyperion Systems has been at the forefront of agrivoltaic development for a decade. To start, could you give us your overview of Hyperion Systems and its mission?
Hyperion was started by my late father in 2009 with the intention of his belief was food first, then energy. We could not be sacrificing our most arable farmland for single-use solar production. Massachusetts at that time was in its first iteration of a solar program called SREC 1. And being from a general contractor in the Pioneer River Valley in Western Mass with some of the best farmland in the state, there was already too much prime farmland taken up for single-use solar. Hyperion is committed to, our mission is to put more renewable electrons onto our grid while providing farmers with meaningful revenue diversification in the form of direct project ownership or lease payments.
You have a decade of project development experience. What initially sparked your interest in agrivoltaics?
So it was really a family company. I grew up working, the general contracting side was our prime family business. Like I said, Dad got into this based on interest. How can we install systems that don't take farmland out of production? So it started in 2009, and by 2010, what NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab, calls the first agrivoltaic project in the U.S. was built in South Deerfield, and that was an original design. Dad had to set out and actually create a racking system that would support his intention of what a dual-use system would look like. It's a fixed-tilt, south-facing, pretty robust, over-engineered system, but that was his thought mentality as a general contractor. I built something once and never have to come back. So that was the very first one in South Deerfield, Center for Ag, Food, and Environment in South Deerfield. And he did 5 other commercial projects with farms across the valley. My interest growing up in the family business, so it was really from day one, from original Hyperion. I was on site in South Deerfield in 2010, 11, during those early days of Hyperion. My interest continued as I finished up high school and then ultimately at college, really from an environmental sustainability standpoint. I'm not a farmer or really have any farming background. My background is in general contracting, construction, and learning about how we can create different systems. Systems that would support our grid resiliency, support ecology, and not take land out of production. And then last, and what's really become my prime interest is keeping farmers on farmland. And that's what agrivoltaics represents to me. It's a revenue diversification, meaningful revenue diversification. While we have state programs that support farmers and farms, it's sometimes, quite often, lacking. Farmers' margins are very tight in the Northeast, especially. And how we keep farmers continuing farming is of critical importance.
What were some of the early challenges you faced in this relatively new field?
Lack of proof of concept, I think, and that still persists, right? There's not enough examples that we can point to of a climate similar to Massachusetts for a whole variety of crops that we're trying. That South Deerfield site that I mentioned has been doing crop trials now, I think this will be the 9th year. Consistent 4 crops: kale, Swiss chard, green bell peppers, and broccoli. And they've done some other one-off crop trials as well. Dr. Stephen Herbert is the lead agronomist for that site trial. And what that data has shown is that weather variance is really the biggest driver for Massachusetts and agrivoltaics. On the drier years, the crops do as well as, in some cases, better than the control group, the variable group under the partial shading conditions, so the control group in full sunlight. So that's been the biggest challenge, is just the lack of research and knowledge around this. But what I've experienced now, having a couple of commercial client farmers, is that you give them this new microclimate and they'll find a way to make it work. And they'll learn and adapt to the new condition. Growing 2024, as an example, was a level 3 out of level 4 drought in Western Massachusetts. So the broccoli, like at Joe's site, for example, really benefited from the partial shading conditions. It kept more water in the soils and ultimately more growth. Those crops aren't getting as stress, fatigue, and loss of potential yield of the crop. There's some peer review research effort going on, but anecdotally at that site, the crops under the partial shade within the array area did better than the full sunlight control group.
Hyperion Systems has a long history of agrivoltaic R&D. What are some of the key research areas you're currently focused on?
The ones that Hyperion are most directly involved in are cost. So we work with NREL quite often, updating their annual cost models. I was just on a call with them last week, looking at the cost to deploy what we call agrivoltaics. That's maybe a good point to discuss for a moment. Agrivoltaics is going to come in a lot of different shapes and forms. There's a ton of different agricultural practices. There's different racking designs, modules. You see now more semi-transparent modules that offer a whole bunch of potential greenhouses, animal husbandry practices. You can do sheep grazing almost at any utility scale solar site, which is built to maximize energy generation. Our systems are designed to meet Massachusetts SMART program. That's the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target program and definition for agrivoltaics, which states that projects for single axis tracker, that's pretty much exclusively the racking design we're using today, to be 10 feet to module horizontal. So they're built pretty high. And then we also space the rows out further than typical. So we're focused most directly for ourselves on cost. And then our farmers and working with UMass and the agronomy team there, American Farmland Trust, some of the soil health data, UMass A. So that we're collaborating. And my areas of interest are both on the cost side, but then working with folks at UMass and American Farmland Trust are on the yield. How are these crops actually comparing in the yield? And
How do you translate your R&D findings into practical, scalable agrivoltaic projects?
so we've already experienced that ourselves, right? We're developing portfolio level projects or groups of projects based on what we're learning or knowledge gain. Agrivoltaics is not for every farm. It's not for every crop type. So how we deploy that, what farms we're selective and working with goes into those decisions. And then I think at a higher industry-wide level, the information and knowledge gain that we share with NREL is critical. We're also, Hyperion right now is a part of a CETO, Solar Energy Technology Office grant that looks at, it's across 4 or 5 different sites in Massachusetts. Joe's project is one of those sites, looking at the yield impacts and quality of the produce grown.
Agrivoltaics involves balancing the needs of agriculture and solar energy generation. How do you approach the design and implementation of projects to optimize both?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one, like I said, each farm is different, from what they grow to the time that they've been there. We work with a lot of farms that have been established. They're family farms, maybe generational. They know the land and the soil quality, where things grow well. Maybe this is a wetter area, things like that, that really support how the crops eventually are actually going to do under this new microclimate. I would say the biggest thing that changes designs, right? We're focused quite a bit on single axis trackers that offers a much different shade sunlight profile than a fixed tilt system where you see 80 to 90% shade directly behind the panels. So a single axis tracker offers about, we space our rows typically 26, 27 feet post to post on a farm. We just, with now a large potato grower, I think they're the second largest in Massachusetts. Their equipment is quite big, especially their harvest equipment. So we have to space those rows out even further, up to, I think, 35 feet. So the biggest design change is driven by the equipment on hand, what that farmer grows, and then equipment on hand. We find that hand harvesting crops are going to be the best and most compatible right now with agrivoltaics until this industry becomes a little bit more developed, until there's more knowns about it for design.
What specific metrics do you use to measure the success of agrivoltaic projects?
I don't know if there are metrics specifically other than crop yield, right? If we had a total crop loss, then that's a damning response. I think it really comes down to feel with the farmer. How are they navigating this new growing area? How is it operating? How is it working for them? The lease payments are a big driver of that decision for a farmer to pursue agrivoltaics. Like I said, farmers in Massachusetts, their margins are really tight. So they're looking for alternatives to enhance their resiliency as a business. Each one of these farmers is inherently an entrepreneur. They're a business owner. They have their own bills to pay, which I think sometimes gets lost in the general conversation about farms and farmers.
So then they have consistent income or water usage you can measure.
Yes, yeah, consistent income that's independent of the weather that year, right? I mean, in days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 2024, for example, we experienced 21 days over 90 degrees. Pre-industrial revolution, it was 5 days for Massachusetts. 5 days. That's a 400% increase.
Okay.
And by 2050, we could be looking at climate models show up to 50 days over 90 degrees tied to the sun and capacity, but their lease rates are guaranteed independent of flooding conditions like we experienced in the Pioneer Valley in 2023 or a significant drought like in 2022, 2024, 2016 was also a level 3 out of 4 drought. Um, a lot of the climate change conversation in Massachusetts and the Northeast more broadly is focused on the average annual precipitation increase, which is true. That's what the climate models demonstrate and show, but they also show that's a totally different climate. So yes, we might get more days of precipitation and heavy rainfall or snow at different times, but we're also going to see a lot warmer temperatures in times of drought, which we're already realizing. So this not only is the revenue diversification critical, but it's a new opportunity to try a different microclimate and create more local food systems, which is also very core and critical to what Hyperion is doing.
What about using multiple or dual axis versus single axis trackers? Do you do any dual axis as well, or?
We don't at this point. We've looked at it, and I think a lot of our designs, at least for Massachusetts, are driven by the solar program, and the requirements or prescriptive guidelines for what agrivoltaics will look like. Dual axis trackers are not considered within the SMART program. And from what I've seen using Helioscope and a couple of other softwares that we use in early design stages of a project, is that shade profile is pretty intense for the areas directly beneath and around a dual axis tracker. You can imagine that is tracking the azimuth north and south, east and west throughout the day. So that area directly behind, and typically dual axis trackers are like a 5x5 or a 5x20. So that area is receiving considerable shade. Now, if you're looking at land use efficiency, I think you can solve for that with a dual axis tracker, but that's quite a bit different than what the Massachusetts program calls for. And we are working with a landowner in California, a vineyard owner, who would like to run single axis tracker panels directly above their vines, which we're seeing examples of more so across Europe. And this would be, to my knowledge, one of the first agrivoltaic wine grown projects. But that offers huge potential because of the drought conditions that they're experiencing across California, and then also the water rights and water usage potential, conserving and reducing that water usage by cooling the microclimate.
Land use is a critical consideration in agrivoltaics. How do you navigate the regulatory and permitting process for dual use projects?
I think we benefit from our project size quite a bit in these permitting conversations and process. We focus on projects half a megawatt AC to a megawatt AC. We are consulting on larger projects. We're community solar developers, so right away that limits us to 5 megawatts AC and below. And then we focus on smaller project sizes. I think my experience has been quite a bit easier, I think, in the permitting and approval process compared to a 5 megawatt single use where clear cutting trees or taking farmland out of production for this one use. So agrivoltaics has been, I think it's a lot easier development path because you're keeping that land in production. These rural communities want to hear that story. How is the farm actually benefiting from this beyond just a lease payment that is single use solar on farmland? Our strategy, and this is sharing with others and giving away some bit of our homework, but we present alongside farmer partners to Conscom and Planning Board. And so they feel how it's tangibly benefiting someone directly in their community. And then a little bit anecdotally, my experience in Conscom, once they voted and approved a project or a design or a limit of work area, is that they're interested to see this project succeed. They want to see their farmer friends do well. It's usually a vote of support and confidence. Do right, follow construction plan and what we approved, and we want to see you do well. Housing development, single family, low density residential homes are the biggest loss of farmland in Massachusetts and probably across the country. But pretty close to that is also land abandonment. So if we're keeping the land in production and generating renewable energy on the same parcel, it truly is a win-win with multiple other wins stacked in there that we've already touched on a few of them. But water use, conserving more water, that's huge potential benefit.
How do you work with landowners and farmers to ensure successful project implementation?
My background, I think one thing that uniquely fits Hyperion is that we started from a general contracting construction background. When we state to a planning board and a conscom, this is how the construction plan is going to go, we follow through with that. And that's really critical from what I've seen other developers and their approaches as they maybe waver or vary from their original stated intentions. Following through with that, having specific drive lanes as an example, where equipment is going to be on the farmland. Soil compaction is a critical something that we are mindful of throughout the entire project process. Things like cover cropping is another, working with the farmer to ensure that there's water filtration built in, and also that stabilizes the soil while we have heavy construction equipment out there.
Agrivoltaics has the potential to significantly contribute to the clean energy transition. What are the key benefits of this approach compared to traditional solar installations?
Keeping farmers on farmland. That's critical to this, and that's the key benefit. Food security is national security, so that's another big one. As we experience food deserts, as we have bigger cities with suburban expansion, fewer farms in those areas, keeping farmers on farmland is critical to this. And I think also, like I said, it supports these project approval and timelines. If you can tell a conscom, a planning board, a county approval board, how this is going to benefit beyond just an energy generation site, it will make that review process and timeline that much faster, which you then save on lines of credit. You could be looking at 6 months of capital carrying costs compared to a 2 month timeline. We need to quantify that and look at how much faster these projects get approved compared to a single use solar project.
What are the most promising regions or sectors for agrivoltaic deployment?
I see agrivoltaics as having potential or benefit for really all markets. The West makes a whole lot of sense because of their ongoing drought, warmer temperatures, drier. So the work that Greg Barron Gafford at University of Arizona is doing is very encouraging. They're actually able to elongate growing seasons, able to start like carrots as an example, rather than starting them in October, they're able to start them and get a second rotation starting in August. That is a game changer for them. And then in Massachusetts and states similar with land constraint, high population capacity, it offers a dual benefit. We know that ground mount solar is quite a bit cheaper than roof mount than carport by 20% in a lot of cases. So while we want to see roof mount and efficient land use and carports, it comes down to cost quite often. And agrivoltaics is still 20% cheaper than carports. So I see a lot of potential. And just as we deploy more of these sites and other developers in the area, it's from a research perspective, a blank canvas. We're just starting to paint that. And we have a long way to go till we get a more clear picture of what the potential is of agrivoltaics.
What types of crops are best suited for agrivoltaic systems, and what are the potential impacts on crop yield and quality?
Looking at the Northeast, just because that's where Hyperion most of our projects are, leafy greens seem to do the best on any given year. So that's why Dr. Stephen Herbert, the agronomist, started there. Joe Sikowski, that's why he started with broccoli. But I see we don't know. I think there's just huge potential. There's a lot of developers working on cranberry bogs, which in Massachusetts, that's the number one agricultural commodity is cranberries. And so we have a lot of bogland in southeastern Massachusetts. So far, what they've seen are really encouraging results from the variable group, the cranberries under partial shading conditions. I met with cranberry growers doing my diligence back in 2019, and I did not see a pathway forward. I didn't know how we would be able to solve for the 40 feet of peat moss soils that are very loose and unstable. But these developers were able to navigate, and these engineers were able to design for it and have successful projects. So that's just one example of someone like myself who's very involved in agrivoltaics. I don't see a pathway forward. Other people solve for it and are having great successes. Joe will be growing sweet corn under his project this year. He has to rotate out of broccoli because that's a crop you can only grow for so many years consecutively. That's one that researchers will question. How is corn going to do? It's a sun-loving crop. Joe thinks it will do very well, so we'll see. It's leafy greens, I think, are the known at this point. That's where we typically start with our farmers. Let's do lettuce, broccoli. Thinking about also, we need to be very mindful of what does the market say? Are we going to be able to sell this crop? If you have an abundance of Swiss chard, does the public really have an appetite for that? So we need to be mindful of that as well.
How do you address concerns about shading and microclimate effects on crops?
Yeah, that's something. It's a big part of our design and conversations. And Massachusetts allows for up to 50% shading on each individual square foot. There's a software tool that we use in our designs. In our approval process, it's based on that shading tool. So right away, no more than 50% shade on each individual square foot. And that's the areas directly underneath the panels are going to be the most shaded on the single axis tracker. By spacing them out further, we're able to get down to about 43, 44, 45% shade compared to normal baseline conditions. Again, the growing season that year, the weather that year is going to be variable. So it could be a bigger benefit having drier conditions, a bigger benefit to the microclimate, or it could be a wetter year where it might be more challenging. But those challenges are inherent to farming. It's different now with the new microclimate and agrivoltaic system built and these posts that the farm operator, the equipment operator has to be mindful of. But farmers are incredibly resilient. They're used to challenges and things changing quickly. Whether it's a hailstorm, they have to put up protective netting over their fruit crops. There's ever-present challenges. You're growing outside. The growing season in Massachusetts is a pretty short window. So that's also something that is a big part of our design conversations. We're looking at, at most a 90-day cycle for a crop from transplant to harvest. Thinking about what that timeline and window is going to be is we're designing for that. And then we also, a lot of our farms and what we try to encourage is a good regenerative ag practice of cover cropping. It's critical when we're before our construction, before we have equipment out there, but then also over the life of the system, it's a good ag practice. So while I say we have the 90-day growing window, that's typically for the commodity crop or what's going to be marketed and sold, but they are growing something there typically year round.
How does Hyperion System address the economic viability of agrivoltaic projects for farmers and investors?
We see huge potential for revenue streams for farmers involved in agrivoltaic projects. What we're able to offer in lease rates for Massachusetts, because of how the SMART program is structured, is an order of magnitude greater than what they would get in public subsidy from the state, which is really encouraging. All of our farmer clients are grateful for the state level subsidies that they receive. But even still, it's not enough. And so if the state is able to pool multiple state goals within one source of funds or project funds, that's multiple wins within one project. And the lease payments are a lot, greater than what they would be getting from a single-use solar site taking that land out of production or from the subsidy for continuing their ag practice as is. Like I mentioned, we also try to implement or I never tell the farmer how to grow on their land. My typical approach is I know how solar policy and solar is going to work in Massachusetts. I know the general construction, the project build process. So those are the two foul poles. Now teach me about your farming practice, which is going to be the whole playing field. And from there, we design and develop a project.
What are the potential revenue streams for farmers involved in agrivoltaic projects?
Well, it's keeping the land in production. So they're keeping that revenue stream in place. And while there might be a loss or percentage loss of crop yield for that given year, they have the second revenue stream, which is going to be from the sale of electricity, either in the form of direct project ownership, which a farmer realizes more benefit, or from a lease arrangement. And those payments are quite a bit higher than what they'd be receiving from continuing farming as is. I will say there's also potential, and Joe has realized this with his broccoli, selling it at a higher rate than he would be from typical broccoli. This is agrivoltaic broccoli, and I think other farmers across the country, producers, have realized that as well, that there is a real angle towards consumer preference and this sort of storytelling to the consumer about how the farm is transitioning to more eco-friendly practices. And
That
also, a lot of our farmers actually are off takers. These are community solar projects, so we have subscribers. Farmers also benefit from reduced power bills, and our target rate is 15%, some as high as 20%. Joe, for example, uses about $100,000 a year worth of power, so that's tangible. He's saving close to 20,000 a year just in his utilities bills by being a subscriber to the project. So there's really three ways of revenue: continue farming, lease payments, or project ownership payments from the sale of electricity, and then that reduced electricity price. It's not free electricity, but it is substantially reduced.
What are the biggest technological advancements you see influencing agrivoltaic within the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm really excited by these semi-transparent modules. I think you see a lot of examples early on of greenhouses and swapping out typical glass for glass that has solar cells. And maybe they're not as compact as the 72 cell and sort of solving for that efficiency. But looking at solar cell manufacturing, not only just spacing the cells out to make it sort of semi-transparent, but actually still in the solar cell, the wafer itself is transparent. So that's something that I'm really excited by. More efficient single axis trackers, some racking equipment, technological efficiencies, how the farmer is able to control that preset software for when they are actually operating equipment in there. That's something that we could see some efficiency or some increase in. I think those are the two that would probably jump to mind right away. Is cell manufacturing and then single axis tracker.
What about bifacial solar panels?
We're using bifacials on most all of our projects, and that's actually
Okay.
a conversation point. Being mindful of so bifacials, right? Just for the audience, monofacial, you're producing power on one side. You typically see those used for roof mounted because they're directly on a roof. Bifacial, you have a solar cell and you're actually capturing energy on the backside of the panel as well, which can be up to double digits more in terms of energy production over a year. So when we're designing on farmland, we're trying to be thoughtful of making it as efficient as possible. So single axis trackers, that's a double digit increase in energy capture compared to a fixed tilt system. And then the same with a bifacial. It's not 10% jump, but certainly 6-8% increase in energy generation, kilowatt hours generated compared to a monofacial panel. Those cells are typically closer together, looking like a panel, the module that's behind you.
What about electrification on farms? Some farms are electrifying all their equipment and saving on fuel costs.
Yeah, there's potential there as well. And something that I would love to see. We have three-prong outlets, a typical 120-volt outlet at our equipment pads for these sites. So I don't know, the electric tractors probably use a higher voltage, but there is potential to directly benefit from a solar array and then literally farm there. Joe, as an example, has an electric vehicle, delivery vehicle. He has a Thermo King refrigeration unit on this electric vehicle. So he's distributing agrivoltaic broccoli in an electric vehicle to the local community. It's a good closed loop story. I mentioned a project, a vineyard owner in California that we're working with. They have a lot of electrical tractors and harvesters. So you see equipment going in that direction. It's fewer moving pieces, no oil changes. It makes a lot of sense for this equipment. That, like you mentioned, the fuel cost is one consideration, but O&M is another as well. I think we're not quite there yet. I don't think we're at the tipping point where the market is going to be really aggressively pushing in that direction, but eventually we'll get there.
How does Hyperion Systems stay ahead of the curve in terms of innovation?
Ongoing conversations, webinars, just staying close to our researcher friends at the DOE and NREL, just being mindful of what the market is doing, try to explore and push the boundaries ourselves as well. The cost to produce an agrivoltaic system is always going to be at the forefront. So need to be mindful of that. What is the ratepayer compensating for? But also trying to push boundaries, like I mentioned, with some of those semi-transparent panels would be one way to push the conversation forward. And then I think also farmer benefits is something that we also really focus on. So we talked about the three revenue streams, but farmers can also benefit from having electricity on site at a remote farm field where they otherwise have to bring gas power generator, or we install wells. So well points for them to then have irrigation rather than bringing irrigation equipment out to a remote field. They now have wells paid for by the agrivoltaic system on site.
And they can just integrate batteries. What about LED, blue and red LED lights for increasing the time that plants get exposure to light?
We've looked at that. So we would have lighting set up for overnight or dusk and dawn. Yeah, we've looked at that, but I think getting to the cost of to produce a system, it's prohibitive at this point. But that is something that we're looking at. Similar to how Arizona, that example I offered, could we elongate the growing season or growing timeline to have multiple rotations of a crop on a field?
Or in greenhouses, add those LED lights with
Yeah.
solar powered LED lights. What are the biggest policy and regulatory changes needed to accelerate the adoption of agrivoltaics?
Massachusetts has really encouraging policy for agrivoltaics. I think you'll see. So we have a greenfield subtractor, which discourages developers from implementing single-use solar on farmland, and we have an agrivoltaic adder. So I think those policies, just focusing on the Commonwealth, those policies are working well as intended. At the federal level, we're really just hoping that the investment tax credit, the 30% ITC holds or is generally similar to how it's written today. We'll see. Of course, we have a new federal administration where Hyperion is very active in policy and lobbying conversations at the federal level right now. I was in DC last week presenting to a group of bipartisan House of Representative aides. So hoping that those conversations secure the 30% or at least have some farmer friendly aspect to it as these tax credits might get rewritten. I will say that in these conversations, especially with the Republican side, the manufacturing is well received, the jobs, the grid resiliency, the national security, because this is energy generation, but it's also farming. It's keeping farmers on farmland. And that's the point that they care most about. How is it tangibly benefiting farms within their districts? And being able to tell that story with a group of national developers, it's well received. So I'm hopeful for the 30% ITC remaining in place. Encouraging policy, if we going to that point, I don't think it will happen, but if there was a 10% investment tax credit bonus for agrivoltaic systems, American Farmland Trust just came up with their own definition for agrivoltaics a week ago. And I don't want to misquote it, but it's something along the lines of any farming practice while simultaneously within a solar array that's considered agrivoltaics. And I think that's a good definition because we don't want to be exclusive to any farming practices. I mentioned that sheep grazing can be done at a traditional utility scale solar site. Not many design modifications need to happen, but that is absolutely agrivoltaics. Sheep grazing is the number one agrivoltaic per acre example of agrivoltaics in the US. I didn't state that very well, but I think the message is there. And so we're designing, Hyperion's designs are based around a lot of Massachusetts policy, 10-foot to single axis tracker height, 50%, no more than 50% shade. Those are the two biggest design criteria.
What role do government incentives and subsidies play in driving agrivoltaic development?
It's like the number one role. And you see it in Massachusetts, now New Jersey, second state to develop agrivoltaic incentive, and you see developers designing with ongoing continued ag use in mind. It still blows me away that developers are grading sites independent of single use or dual use solar. It's just not a good practice. And I think ultimately the developer will pay more or system owner is going to pay more over time in O&M costs because of things like soil erosion, rainwater issues, runoff issues. Whereas if you're designing for continued ag use over time, the land is going to stay more stable and you're going to realize more benefits as the system owner. So I think policy drives how systems are designed. Of course, solving for lowest cost of energy is going to be at a developer or system owner's forefront. But if we have more mindful and long-term policy conversations, I think we'll see more agrivoltaics deployed.
How can agrivoltaics contribute to broader sustainable land use practices and food security?
So we mentioned keeping farmers on farmland, so that's food security right there. Reduce water usage, especially in drier or drought conditions for the Northeast. Having this diversified revenue stream, Joe is a good example of this. So now from the same parcel of land that his margin was maybe more tight on, it's an order of magnitude greater. So he's actually he's purchasing organic matter from other farms and then spreading that on the field after he's harvested like the broccoli for the past 2 growing seasons before he plants his cover crop. So he's plowing in that new organic matter, actually trying to enhance the soil quality over time. His mentality is, why are we just trying to be sustainable? Let's make this better. That field he's been growing there for over 10 years, but it was a Christmas tree farm at some point in the decades past, and that landowner stripped the topsoil, probably sold it off. But that high organic matter quality, that's been lost. And you see it at that site. And that's why Joe wanted to start there, is because this was a bit of a test trial for him. He was never going to put it on his highest valued land. And so we started there. And so how can we actually make this better? How can we implement more regenerative ag practices and make this a more sustainable land use practice?
What are the potential synergies between agrivoltaics and sustainable agriculture practices?
So for my environmental studies, this really is biomimicry. We're going to millennia-old practices of silvopasture, agroforestry. That's like exactly what this is, just with newer technology. Instead of trees, we're using solar panels to provide shade for cattle, which in those days above 90 degrees, they're not producing as much milk. So that kind of gets to the food security prior question, just as an example of how agrivoltaics can be solving for that.
For aspiring professionals interested in agrivoltaics, what advice would you give them?
This is just starting out. Like I said, the canvas is just starting to get painted. Read as much as you can. There's great literature out there. I mentioned Dr. Greg Barron Gafford. Iowa State University is doing great work with this. Oregon State University. Read as much as you can. Listen to these interviews. There's now a national conference, the Solar Farm Summit. I'll give Dan French a plug there. That happens this year. I think it's happening in the first week of August, so plenty of time to get your ticket and travel accommodations. It's a really welcoming community. People want to share their knowledge. So it's the knowledge is to be gained out there. If you're coming from, I'm a solar project developer. So there's an abundance of opportunities, I think, with solar development. The community is waiting to see what happens federally, but overall it's a strong market. And I think that there's going to be continued opportunities and different angles to take from research to development side to R&D. We talked about how manufacturing and the equipment that we use is going to change over the time. So I would just say learn and start making inroads because you'll get passed along to somebody else and not passed along, but encouraged to speak with other folks and people generally make time for one another in this industry.
How can they get involved with Hyperion Systems to contribute to the agrivoltaic industry?
Well, I'd say at this point, we're looking to scale. So farmers would be the folks that we're most interested in talking with. But I think I don't have a newsletter set up at this point. That would be the best way. But we do make regular updates on our website and the Instagram and social media posts. So that's probably the best way to follow along and see our journey as we continue to grow.
And we'll include your social media on the description for this
Thank you.
video. Jake, this has been an incredibly insightful and valuable conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise and work of Hyperion Systems with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Always great to expand the agrivoltaic community.
And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on Clean Titans. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more insightful and exclusive interviews into the world of clean energy and sustainable agriculture. Until next time, stay engaged and keep growing.